Hello and welcome. I'd like to start today's video by actually showing you something that I didn't make. This chessboard right here was a gift from my brother when I was quite a bit younger, maybe 10 or 11 years old. I had just joined the middle school chess team and I was excited about learning to play chess with other people. My brother made this for me as a Christmas gift that year. And I do realize, looking back on it with adult eyes, that this skill is probably beyond something that a 10-year-old could do. Actually, he would have been 8 or 9 at the time, so it's definitely beyond the skill of an 8 or a 9-year-old, and thus my father probably had something to do with it as well. I'd like to show you how to make a chessboard like this, and I do realize that there are probably 100 videos showing you how to make a chessboard. Seems like it's a rite of passage for those who make woodworking videos to make a video about making chessboards. So I'm going to do something a little bit more unique. I'm going to show you the standard way of making a chessboard, similar to those other videos, but then I'm going to challenge myself twice to come up with something a little bit more skillful and that maybe produces a little bit more interesting of a result. So I hope you'll come along with me and perhaps follow along yourself in making chessboards in 3 different levels. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about material choice. Now, in this board that my brother and my father made, it's interesting because it's made of one type of material. Both the light and the dark colored pieces here are a standard oak. It's just that these darker ones appear to have been stained. Now, that's actually a more difficult way of putting a board together because it means once you've done your glue ups, you actually have to be pretty flat on the surfaces because you don't have a lot of room to work with in sanding later. The more classic way of doing it is to work with woods that have contrasting colors to begin with. And of course, the most classic version of that is to take maple and pair it with walnut. That's a nice contrast, and I think it would make a great chessboard if that's what you'd like to do. However, I want to do something a little different. Instead of using this walnut, I'd like instead to use this African Padauk, which has more of a orange-red kind of color to it, but still makes a great contrast with the maple. The material thickness is important to keep in mind as well. I want a 3/4 inch board when I'm all done, and that means I need to start with something a little thicker because I'm probably going to be planing it down a little bit to get it nice and flat after the glue ups. So starting with a 4/4 or 1 inch board, or a 5/4 and 1 1/4 board is probably the best way to go. We'll start the build now by cutting these 2 types of boards down into the strips that we'll use to make the chessboard. The first step in preparing the material is to cut it down to the length that I need. Each square of the chessboard is going to be 2 inches by 2 inches, so the length that I need is at least 16 inches. But I want to go a little bit further. Here I'm cutting it down to 18 inches. Cutting the length first helps with the jointing and planing. So quick unplanned note. I don't know how evident it was in the video when I was cutting on the miter saw, how much I was struggling getting through this. I knew the board was twisted a little bit, but wow, it's really twisted. Look at the difference, the gap here on the straight edge. If I were to mill it this way, there'd be no board left. So the only thing I can really do about that is to cut it first lengthwise also and try and get some of that twist out just in having less material. It's a little debatable about whether I want to do that on the table saw or not. We'll see if I can get it flat. If not, I'll have to do it by hand using a hand saw, a little more controllable. That way I don't want it pinching and kicking back on me. Also, it means I'm going to have to cut it a little wider than it's eventually going to be. And I'll cut it again later because I can't guarantee I'll have 90-degree turns on those corners. Sometimes it's fun working with natural products like wood. I did find it possible to cut it down with the table saw, though I had to be very careful doing so. Like most woodworking videos, the cuts here are sped up quite a bit, so don't be fooled about how much caution is needed. I used the jointer both to flatten down one of the faces and to get a perfect 90-degree edge. What I hope you can see in this video is the difference of the material. I was able to use the full width of this maple piece here. In fact, the first board was so flush with the table, I didn't even do the face, just the edge. Now contrast that with these Padauk boards. This first one isn't too bad. The second board though shows you that even at just over 2 inches, I'm ending up with quite a bit of twist inside of this board and having to do several passes on a jointer. Now if you're wondering what I'm doing with the pencil mark after I cut them, it's because I had already ripped these on the table saw. That meant that neither of the edges had a rough face to them, so I needed to mark which one actually was 90-degree jointed. Now normally I probably wouldn't plane these boards until after the glue up. I simply wanted to remove some of the funny angles from this twisted board. The next step is to cut all of the pieces, both Padauk and maple, down to the same size, that 2 inches that I'm looking for in each of the pieces. In all you need 4 strips of each color. You'll notice that I've got 8 here. Turns out I'm actually making 2 boards. For the glue up, lay the boards out in alternating colors, and you can put them on their end and just put a liberal amount of glue all over the place and spread it all around. The thing that will save you the most amount of work in the end is that when you do this glue up, you make sure that everything is nice and flat. To accomplish that, I'm going to use some cawls on both sides as well as down the middle. Because I use quite a bit of glue, of course there are little drips that are hanging off once it's all hardened up, and I use a 5-in-1 paint tool to get rid of those. I then take it over to the miter saw where I can cut off just a little bit off of the 2 ends to make sure it's all squared up on all of the edges. The next step is to cut it into strips once again. I want those strips to be the exact same size as before. I think the best way to do that is to actually align the blade with the existing strips rather than try and use a tape measure or other measuring device. Once it's nice and lined up, I need to cut it down into 8 strips. It's times like these that I actually wish we had some smell-o-vision that goes along with these videos. I always love the smell of a wood shop as you're cutting wood, but this African Padauk is just a different smell compared to a lot of the other hardwoods that you work with. Anyway, are you ready for the grand reveal on how to put a chessboard together? Once you have these strips cut out, it's simply a process of taking every other one and flipping them around like this. And then the glue up process is the same. You just have to make sure that you're putting a nice straight board that everything's going to be butting up against on this one side so that everything lines up perfectly and you don't have any shifting. That's it. There's a lot of videos that show you how to do this. So we'll make sure we do this in an even more complicated way after this one. Quickly though, before we do that, I did put a border onto these boards. And I did that by gluing thin strips of the Padauk and the maple together, cutting them to size, and doing the appropriate glue up. I'm going to leave the final finishing to the end when all of the boards are done. For chessboard number 2, we're going to use some of the same materials and techniques that we used in the first chessboard, but like I said, we're going to increase the skill level a little bit more and make something, I think, a little bit fancier in terms of the final chessboard that we get. I am going to use the maple that I used from the previous build, and in much the same way. However, instead of using a contrasting color in wood to complement that particular piece of maple, instead I'm going to use epoxy. So we're going to create strips like we did before, and instead of gluing them together, we're going to kind of glue them together with strips of epoxy in them. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. The important thing, of course, is that we're going to be working at this particular thickness, something about 3/4 to an inch thick, which means that a normal epoxy won't always work. You need to make sure that you're getting a thick set epoxy. And I have not done a thick pour before of epoxy, so we'll see how this particular one goes. The melamine here that I've also brought in as materials, that's going to make up the form that I'm going to do the pour inside of. And I'm going to treat it with a mold release when I do. So wish me luck on this particular one. I've seen people do this before, and I know it can sometimes be a little hairy. Hopefully we won't have any sort of problems here in this build, but let's give it a try and find out. Now you've already seen me create the strips of wood that will make up the squares of the chessboard, so let's skip that part and go over to the epoxy form. I countersunk some holes and then I screwed the whole thing together. And no, you don't need to wear safety goggles for this sort of thing, but aren't they so fashionable on me? To keep the epoxy from leaking out, I then caulked around all of the edges. As someone who has more of a construction background than even a woodworking one, let me tell you the secret to caulking is getting a good caulk gun. Do not use those cheap ones you get at the box stores. My goal for the epoxy pour is to make sure that the strips that I'm pouring are the exact same thickness as the strips of wood themselves. To accomplish this goal, I cut off little bits off of the end of the strips of maple, and I'm now gluing the strips together with those little bits to make sure the separation is exactly the same. I've moved to the finishing room in order to do this pour, hopefully in order to keep the dust down. I also start by screwing down the piece into the form. I'm doing this in a section that shouldn't be in the final piece, and I'm doing it because I know sometimes the boards can float in the epoxy. The next step is to mix up the epoxy itself. Now the epoxy is clear. I'm going to add a little black dye to it, and then I'm going to use some powder that is both blue and purple. My hope for the final board is that you'll see swirls of blue and purple in there, and it won't necessarily be a translucent cell on the board. The thing that I learned pretty quickly is that my setup in my finishing room is not nearly as level as my assembly table. Once I poured the epoxy in, I was actually fighting it quite a bit with little shims to try and get it nice and level. Well, it's been 5 days. I'm pretty curious to see whether the mold release is going to let me do this with some hand tools or whether I'm going to have to resort to the table saw. Only one way to find out. And of course, the final answer was the table saw. I cut 2 sides off with that, and then I switched over to the miter saw to do the other 2 sides, making sure everything is nice and 90 degrees. With the sides off, the hammering became a little bit easier, and I got the backing off by hand. Several passes through the sander later, and I had some even sides on both sides. The next step is the exact same as with the first board. I need to cut these down into 8 strips, making sure that both sides of the squares are the same. I don't know how visible this is on the video, but there are little burls that have come up here from the sanding, which means the epoxy still wasn't completely all the way set. We'll see. I'm going to give it a few more days before I do the next pass, so hopefully it'll be good by then. We do have to go a little bit further down. Now, this one works just like the first chessboard. We have to glue it all together. The problem is that wood glue will not work onto the epoxy here, and every joint is going to be wood to epoxy. The solution to that is actually to use epoxy as the glue. So that's what I'm going to do here next. I don't have to use the thick pour. I can use the regular epoxy that I've worked for thinner pours before. So I'm going to mix some of that up. I'm going to clamp that together, and then I'm going to give that at least 24 hours to dry. Using parchment paper from the kitchen with epoxy is a trick I discovered making some Christmas ornaments this year. I put some of that down, and then I put epoxy on both of the edges of the pieces that I'm gluing together. Then, much like the first board, I use some cauls to make sure that everything is nice and aligned and flat. As I was sanding it down after the glue up, I had kind of a crazy idea. Why don't I use an epoxy border as well? Although that does mean that I have to use the thick epoxy again, and that's going to be another 5 to 7 days. So I'm going to try a new technique this time. I'm not going to even bother with the mold release. Cutting it off with the table saw was just fine from before. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this guy in here. You can see I've given it 3/4 of an inch of border all around. I want somewhere around 1/2 inch or 3/8 when I'm all done. I'm going to caulk the edges like I did before to keep it from leaking, but this time I'm actually going to caulk around the edges of the board as well and stick that down. And that should keep the epoxy from going underneath the board, hopefully. So that is what I did. I put caulk around all 4 edges, and then I pushed it down into the form. Using a 3/4 inch piece of scrap wood, I positioned it around all 4 of the borders, and then I got ready to mix up the epoxy. The border is going to be black, but I put a little white pearl opalescence inside of it as well, just to give it a little of a sparkle. While the epoxy sets up, it was time to move on to the 3rd board. This board is going to be made of walnut and maple, but this time it's going to be a little thinner. So I'm resawing the board down on the bandsaw and then planing it flat, and then putting it together in the same way that I did on the other board. The difference this time is I'm taking the thin boards and gluing them to a backer board that's also supposed to be pretty thin. If you ever wanted a visual representation of why you can never have too many clamps, well, here you go. Now I realize that I probably gave the game away, in this case literally, by showing you what I'm building in the title image to this video. This third board isn't just a chessboard, it's also a backgammon board. These thin shapes that I'm routering out here, on a backgammon board they're called points. And the easiest way for me to have made these points is to actually have cut them out on my laser, but I sometimes get complaints about using tools that not everyone has. And so I'm going to show you how to do it using a template and a router first. The template is also created on a laser, but it's easy enough to buy. In fact, I'll probably post this one up on my Etsy store when I'm done with this video. The template has a 1/8 inch offset, so I can use it with a templating bit on my router. I cut out 3 shapes and then I flip it over using the connection holes to make sure everything is lined up perfectly, and then I do the other 3. For those of you with laser cutters, I'll also show that. You can just cut out the points into a thin board and glue that on top of the board instead of routering it all out. Either way, we end up with pockets that we can either put wood inlay in or epoxy inlay. I'm going to go with epoxy inlay. Now, because the laser cut board was glued on top of the chessboard, and because I don't trust wood glue when working with epoxy, I first brush in a clear epoxy and let that set up to make sure I don't have any leaks. After giving the clear epoxy about 24 hours to set up, I can pour in the inlay epoxy. I start with this white color, which has a little opalescence to it, and then once that's all done, I move on to the black. I think the right way to have done this would have been to wait for the white to set up completely before moving on to the black. I didn't do that. There are a couple places where it shows just a little bit, so while I do recommend being patient, I got away with it this time. I only needed 24 hours for the epoxy to set up, and then I sanded it down by hand. Once that was done, I can move on to the trim work. The trim pieces are also going to be made out of walnut, but they're a little more complicated than in the first board. On the chessboard side, I need the pieces to be 1/4 of an inch, but in some cases on the backgammon side, I need them to instead be 1/2 of an inch. And so I have to run them through the dado saw to get that difference on both of the sides. For the glue up, the board rests on what is essentially a rabbet cut. I clamp that into place and let it set up, and then there are little trim pieces that I need to add into a dado cut that I'd made into the board. Okay, so this last step is actually a bit of a compromise, and it's a result of me not doing my research well enough ahead of time. It turns out that backgammon pips come in 2 standard sizes. One is 1 inch and one is 1 1/4. I've got the smaller size here, which is 1 1/4. But having used 2-inch sections here for my chessboard, it didn't really give me enough space to be able to fit all 6 of the backgammon pips onto their points, and also have the space that is typically put there where these pips can rest in their home. So I've had to actually make it so that this back piece here is a little bit thinner, and I might even have to sand down this edge a little bit in order to have it just kind of rest in there. It means that I don't have a miter edge on this corner, but I think it'll still look pretty good, and on the top board it will have a 1/4 inch border around the whole thing. Sometimes that's how projects go. If you don't get them all planned out as much as you need to in advance, you just have to adapt as best you can. Once the trim was all put in place, it was time to finish up the boards. This is sometimes my favorite part because of how the shine comes out. On all 3, I'm using a hard wax oil, and I'm giving that some time to set up. I'm also doing 2 coats. The chess and backgammon board does need one final touch. There's a little bit of hardware that needs to be added. So I use one of my hinge boring templates, and I inset the hinges and I put on the front hardware. And then of course I have to give it a try. Well, here they are. All 3 chessboards are done, and I love every one of them. Each one does have an increasing difficulty level and amount of skill that you need to put it together though. So I thought I would talk about very quickly how long it took to do each one and a lesson I learned in making them. And we'll start with this basic chessboard. I would say that the chessboard itself took me about an hour to put together, and putting the border on was another 30 minutes. However, the whole time to get it done is still around 24 hours or so if you're keeping up with your glue ups, because that's just how long it takes to get those all glued together. A lesson I learned is that the Padauk and maple, when sanded together, actually kind of blend a bit. The orange-red sawdust that comes off of the Padauk gets into the pores of the maple and gives it a slightly orange hue. I probably could have fought that a little bit if I wanted to, but I actually like the natural things that wood does when they work together. And so I actually like the final output, and I'm leaving it the way it is. The epoxy board took probably twice the amount of time in just terms of the work to get it done. But the real increase in time was the setup time for the epoxy. This board took over 2 weeks to get done completely, which is quite an increase over the original. I learned a couple lessons off this. One is that you should start thick with your material. I ended up sanding it down so many times with the epoxy kind of bubbling up over the top that you can see it became quite a bit thinner than the board beneath it. The other lesson I learned is that when you're going to take caulk and put it down into a form when working with epoxy, you probably should stay a little bit away from the edge. You can see right here there's a couple little white marks. That's from the caulking where it bled up around the edge when I was doing the epoxy border. It's going to be on the bottom of the board, so it's not too big of a deal, but it is something I can learn from in the future. This final board, I would say that the time it took me was about 1 day's worth of work, 7 or 8 hours to put all of this together, both the chessboard side, the border, and of course, all of the inside bits, both the framing and the epoxy inlay for the backgammon board. I did learn a couple of lessons here as well. Of course, I've already mentioned that 2 inches isn't quite big enough to work with 1-inch pips for a backgammon board. But the other lesson I learned was how much epoxy I need to fill in each one of these inlays here. If you look closely, a few of these are a little wider than the others because when I had to mix up a second little batch of epoxy, I didn't get the mixture right with the dye compared to the ones that I'd done previously. I think you have to be looking to see that, but I can see it. So nothing's ever really perfect, but I still love each one of these boards. I hope you enjoyed watching this as well. I tend to wait till the end of these videos to ask you to subscribe, but if you did make it this far and you enjoyed seeing all of this put together, I would encourage you to do so. When you do, it helps other people see it as well. I'm also very curious what you think about each one of these boards, or whether you have a different style in mind that I could look into in the future. Please leave a comment if you do. Otherwise, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the builds that I put together, and I hope that you'll come and join me in a future video where I do something completely new.